And yeah, I have a very long title, and it's called Tactics for Designing Experiences for Complex Applications. And I ran out of breath. This is a very long title, but really what it means is something very simple. It's continuous improvement. And well, just in case yeah, you're not familiar with UX, I'm going to give a couple of ideas, and I'm going to put it from the perspective of the UX designer. But I hope some of that is also applicable to you. And if not, please raise your hand, let me know, and I will try to find a way to tie up some of the ideas so the topic matches the audience. About me, if you know me, I don't like to talk too much about myself, you know, because then you start putting the years together and then, okay, if he has 20 plus years of experience, and okay, let's stop it there, right? Like, let's say I'm a kid from the 80s, but at the same time I started too early, and in the meantime, I've been designing for almost 2 decades, and I'm designing pretty much anything you can imagine, but here, certainly I've been doing quite a lot of fintech. I certainly work in the energy field. I work on telecommunications. Also, we're recently dipping our toes into the AI and machine learning. And all of that is quite fun and quite entertaining. At the same time, I had a lot of collaborations. I, well, certainly worked with over 25 different product owners and product managers, and way more developers, around 300. And I learned a couple of things from them, right? And I guess the first thing that you have to learn from them is that you have to reach them, you have to meet them where they are, right? Okay, so the first thing is that I'm not going to assume that everybody will have the key definitions that I'm going to share. And if I'm not explaining them in the way that you would prefer, please raise your hand. Feel free to stop any given time. And the first thing is that I'm going to try to cover 3 aspects, you know, like what is user experience, which just by that we can spend the whole, I don't know, 3 months on that, complexity and tactics. I'd like to explain it like this, you know, and for pretty much every single designer will have a bit of a different explanation of what user experience is. But down the line is a ratio between your expectations and reality. You know, so sometimes you are really excited about something, and then, hey, that movie wasn't really what you were expecting, right? Hey, sometimes that ratio matches 1 to 1. And this is a really good opportunity for us as designers to improve, but also it's a really good example of what happens when really good expectations matching good designs, and the people do not really notice it, right? Like, just start thinking about how many objects you have utilized today, and most of them were just men, right? Like, hey, you didn't think about it because you are either accustomed to that, or maybe it's just so standard and simple that you don't really pay attention to that. Well, that's exactly what I'm working on. My job is not wowing people. There are certainly some designers that are really focused on trying to make great experiences. For me, it's just kind of like the kind of experiences that nobody thinks about. And I'm happy with that. Let's say, for me, in reality, it doesn't matter, you know, the reality and the expectations. If the hamburger is thin, the expectations need to be thin. If the hamburger is full, the expectations and the reality need to match in the same ratio, right? The only thing that I cannot do is that, certainly, if there is a mismatch, that's a problem for me. Okay, there is another part. Simple and complex could be parts of a different perspective, and we can talk about multiple theories, but down the line is when we have human experiences and our own senses and our own capabilities, we are all limited. And personally, I am limited by some aspects, you know, like, well, I need to wear glasses, but some other people have other limits, and that certainly have been covered in a way by culture, by technology, by habits, you name it, right? We have ways for us to move ahead with our lives. Now, the thing is that once we try to stretch out our limits from, let's say, what is humanly possible, that's the moment when we need to use technology. Because certainly, if we need to see a star, well, there is X amount of optometry that I need to do in order to make that happen, right? Now the issue is that when we have a lot of technology and a lot of complexity, most likely our interfaces need to be much better at delivering what we need when we need it, right? So if we have a human scale and a non-human scale, and most likely some of that could be way more present once we start dealing with the AI, we're going to have a much richer interface, right? I guess until now we haven't had the real experience of human-computer interaction. Now we're having it. What do we do with that? Well, I don't know. Cat photos with Midjourney, I guess that's it. Okay, what do we mean by complex systems? And certainly everybody that works in technology likes to describe their own product as complex, and certainly that's because that's where you're coming from, right? You're seeing that from that perspective, but the user needs to see it as something simple. That's somehow the middle ground what we're trying to do in order to achieve user friendliness and most likely market fit. But let's say, at least for this talk, complex systems. Okay, even my tongue doesn't really want to say that, you know. Are systems that you cannot control. You can only manage it. You can, in the best of the days, you can have an idea of what's going on, and sometimes you don't have that idea in real time. You have to wait, I don't know, 3-6 months until you have finally a good understanding of what the hell happened, right? So for that, certainly, we built quite a lot of technology, but also we need to build some practices, and that's why I'm saying that we need to have tactics. One thing that we need to understand is that when we are talking about strategy and tactics, sometimes we misunderstand what is the place, and sometimes some conversations, especially with consultants, it goes around the strategy, you know, the high level understanding. And that can be fun, but certainly once you deliver something and once you decide the path and the direction, most likely when things get screwed up is when you didn't communicate the kind of tactics that get things done. And this is obviously complicated because you're dealing with the level of culture of the organization. Obviously, strategy, fantastic, but really culture is what really is driving all decision making, right? So how does it look like? When we have a strategy, we are having the what and the why. You know, normally it's a long-term process, long-term decision making. We can have, let's say, some agile process that shorten some of the cycles, but really down the road, it's just about having a good level of understanding about our key objectives and kind of like an idea of how we're going to achieve them, right? And then most likely we're going to get into the how. And how is where most of the time user experience happens or just doesn't. And this is a very special place because if you have worked with so many development teams, you know that you are going to have some commitments that have to be done. And sometimes the first thing that gets chopped is trying to make it user-friendly and accessibility. And all of those KPIs that somehow are really hard to measure, right? But down the road is where the user is receiving that and is saying, well, I can work with that or not. And really, sometimes it's really interesting because building that product is extremely complicated, extremely expensive. It's like 99% of the job, and then 1% is almost done. And that's exactly the 1% that describes things, right? Okay, so for that I'm going to give you 5 tactics. And that doesn't mean that there's only 5 tactics, and that doesn't mean that most of those tactics are going to work 100% for you, but this is coming from my experience, right? So hopefully some of that, if somebody's making notes or the video is there, yeah, you're going to be able to adjust that to your own problems, to your own situations. So we're going to be talking about innovation, wayfinding, freedom, communication, and context. So tactic number 1, innovation. Avoid the ex-girlfriend, ex-boyfriend effect, you know? And sometimes I have issues mentioning that, you know, because I don't know if anybody has their heart broken right now, because so yeah, just bear with me. I'm not trying to do any sort of therapy, so please just, And if you need a hug, later on we can just make a session just for that, right? But what I'm saying is that, and this is coming from a real case, I had a friend, Dutch client, that he was going through his third divorce, you know? And somehow he managed to get into the same relationship with different people. And the thing is that he never really stopped and wondered what exactly it meant, why he was getting into the same problems, and why he just managed to marry the same person but with other value, right? And the thing is that sometimes we're not logical, right? And sometimes when we're dealing with in product redesign and digital transformation and sort of initiative that tries to foster innovation, guess what? We don't really stop and think, hey, are we marrying the same person? You know, are we repeating the same problem? Are we trying to find a similar solution that is actually delivering the same products? Okay, and this is very challenging for us as designers because, and I wish I had a bigger screen so you can see all of that. Believe me, if you are on the back side, it's really interesting, you know. But basically, this is a universal model for user interfaces. And really what it does is, it kind of like offers different layers for how you can analyze and you can see a user interface. So at the top level is just making things pretty, right? So we're talking about the style of the font, the layout, all the cool things that you can see online. Well, that's the kind of thing that actually is just the surface, right? It's the presentational side. But what we're really trying to do, very hard, is trying to get to the structure. Is asking those tough questions and saying, hey, how this organizational model, how the task flow, and how the contextual model is working for us. And what sometimes it means is that we need to make decisions on the data model. I've been in situations where I cannot improve a form because the data model doesn't allow me. But this is a very complicated thing to resolve because since we were doing internationalization, not every single country has the same understanding of how the order of information is to be shown, right? So not every single country has the same postal code or has the same way to present people's names, you know? Like myself, I have 4 names, right? So how do you deal with that? Well, certainly you have to localize it. But if your data model doesn't allow it, well, guess what? It's back user interface, right? So this is the kind of thing that if you are really committed to propose something new, you need to go all the way down to how the models and the structure have been set up. If you don't modify that, most likely you cannot go ahead. Okay, this is a very simple one, but it's actually pretty hard. It's wayfinding. It's starting with your navigation and search. And this is a real example, you know, and sometimes when you're looking at the interface and you're looking at something to improve right away, it looks very complicated. It's kind of like, I don't want to open that kind of worms, you know. But really, most of the time, the user is quite forgiving if we offer 2 big opportunities. The opportunity to let the user know where they are at this point, and also where to find what they need to find, right? So if you give any of these 2 clues, you know, and one is obviously explaining the navigation to the user in a way that makes sense, and also giving the user the opportunity to find what they're looking for. Once you start looking at this, and this is kind of like the correlation of, let's say, all the features and places, and I really feel like it's too tiny for the people in the back, but once again, believe me, this one is very complex, and this one is a bit less complex. Once you start looking at the organization, you can start looking at what can you do in order to improve something that we call information architecture. And information architecture, in many ways, is kind of like the same parallel as a building, right? Like we are going to have areas that are going to be commonly used, and then we're going to most likely branch out to multiple areas that maybe some specific people can access, specific people can do some specific tasks, like a kitchen, and there are going to be some opportunities for people to, let's say, connect and collaborate in multiple of those different areas, right? So if you let complexity grow into your software without really analyzing how that information is being structured, and you don't have a plan for that, most likely you're going to end up with something like this, right? And then trying to build the wayfinding in a kind of like a retroactive way is going to be very, very hard. It's still not impossible, just expensive, right? Just an idea of how it looked like after that. And I'm not saying, oh, that was a really cool design. This is like just like having a good idea of how you can have an after and before, right? Okay, do not design yourself into a corner. And for that, okay, this one is a complicated one because we're talking about freedom. And sometimes when you're dealing with really complicated systems that maybe some users have been familiarized in the past, you will know that your information, the information density on the screen is really, really high, right? Like for all the amazing engineers that are accustomed to have a spreadsheet in every single of the 8 screens that they have and somehow make sense out of that, kudos to you. I really love what you're doing, but this is not exactly my example, right? For me, it's trying to do exactly the opposite. It's building a system that allows the system not only to offer the functionality that exists as is, that is required for now, but also offers the opportunity to grow after that. So this is an example of a bulk rename utility, and it's kind of like the poster child of the worst user interface you can imagine, right? There is not a single spot, there is not a single pixel. Oh, maybe one, there is one. So if somebody wants to have a checkbox there, congratulations. Yeah, but they managed to fill every single pixel in the screen. And that's pretty hard, to be honest, but also that's not exactly the best way to build software, right? And the thing is that if you are familiar with the concept of entropy, you know that you start with really good intentions and then time passes, and unless you have a very good way to set up the rules, entropy is going to start, and then we're going to have a disaster, right? So what does it mean to that? Okay, just a simple example, define the rules of what you want to happen, right? So one of the things that I would normally say to you is like, hey, white space is your friend. And what does it mean, you know? Let's say that you're building a city, and you build a city just to be packed with buildings, okay? That's how most of the time that happens, right? But if you don't have those conversations about where you're going to put your parks, where you're going to leave that space for other kind of development to grow, you know, what are the kind of sections that you're going to have for industry, or parking lots, or anything else you can imagine, because cities grow, technology grows, and everything normally changes, you know. You cannot have a city that will be around for 200 years if you build it for the technology that you have it right now, right? So for this space, it's like, hey, you need to build white space for that. Okay, communication. And this is more about how we deliver information. And this is offering the right amount. And what is the right amount that sometimes, you know? And this is the conversations that sometimes I have with product owners, you know? It's like, hey, what is important? And they say, everything. Well, you know, once again, right, if everything is important, that means that nothing is important, right? Well, for that we need to step back and ask those questions, and obviously, depending on the user, you're going to have different answers, right? And if you try to adjust it and make it customizable for them, that's fantastic, but it implies there is some cost, right? So for that, there is another model that I would like to share with you. Is the bite, the snack, and the meal. And that's not only relation of the amount of pizza that everybody had today, but also is a way for us to understand the amount of information that we can consume. And certainly there is very bright people in the room that can consume a lot of information, but the average human can only take, let's say, 5-7 pieces of information at a time, and I will not expect them to memorize them in order to move on to the next screen and have a good sense of what's going on. So you have to be very clever about how you bring what actually matters, which for most of the time is going to be the byte, and the byte looks more like a notification to you, right? looks more like that dashboard that you have in your car that only tells you how fast you are going. And then, if you somehow need a little bit more, you have the snack. And that snack, obviously, is going to be the space where we spend most of the time, where we spend most of the day. And once we get into the middle, that means that something happened. You know, that means that, hey, you're doing your taxes. That means that something broke. That means that the equation or the balance didn't match, right? And for that, it's a very different kind of approach, and most likely you're going to have very specialized people looking at that level of granularity, right? So how does it look like? And this example kind of like delivers all of that in one single screen, which is sometimes necessary, but if you have the opportunity to spread out that level of granularity into multiple screens, I would say that's much better. So let's say, obviously, the byte is just giving me 6 pieces of information, right? Just a percentage of the amount of documents, and this is a real example, that are overdue, late, on progress, and deferred, and the relationship of how much of them are in comparison to the others, right? And then, once you go down to the middle, you can see the amount of level of the, let's say, the same information, but with a different perspective. This is more coming from the person like, hey, I want to see what is going on with that document that has been deferred. There shouldn't be any sort of deferred documents at this point. And then you look really, really deep into, okay, who has this document? Who touched it the last time? How many of those are actually being held? And you can start most likely making calls and potentially firing people, right? So the amount of level of action and the amount of level of information needs to match the activity of the user, right? So next time that you have a similar conversation like, what's important here? Well, now you have an option, right? You can most likely, you have a way to break it down and obviously test it to the point where you understand what exactly is necessary at this point. Tactic number 5, obvious always wins. And this is a very important one, even for designers, you know. And I don't know if it happens to you when you look at, let's say, really cool modern architecture catalogs, and you look at the kitchen and everything's one single block of I don't know, I don't even know the material, right? It looks amazing, looks shiny, but you might not be able to cook there, right? Because everything is very minimalistic, you know. We try to be super clever. And we try to like, okay, what is the handle of the Tesla? Oh, okay, well you push it and then you move it like that, and it's like, okay, that looks cool, right? But you will need to explain it all the time, and most likely all of that information could be used for something else, right? And this is a very important topic for a designer that builds applications for people that are normally either very, very busy or any second chance. And in the case of oil and gas, as we have mentioned, when there is an emergency and there is a situation where the designers make things complicated, you are going to potentially run into what is commonly called the fallacy of the smart person. And I want you to visualize this, right? Like most likely we have a room of 5 to 6 people. We have all of them have been handpicked by HR, you know, so we know that they're very clever people, very smart people. They have a lot of time educating themselves, and most likely there is a good level of IQ as an average, right? And so all of them are very smart, and the issue is that all of them are very similar too, and the issue is that all of them are making decisions during the day, and all of them potentially are not under any circumstance where actually their life is at risk, and they haven't spent that much time maybe in the field, maybe on a circumstance that is really demanding, and potentially if they made a mistake, somebody dies, right? So we are in a very different context, right? We're still trying to be very smart, and most likely we are building interfaces for people that are very smart too. I built interfaces that are just built for only 4 people in the world, and all of them had PhDs. Like, that's awesome. But I would assume that if that person wakes up at 3 a.m. in the morning and have a cup of coffee, most likely I'm a bit smarter than them at this point, right? So the scenario is like this. Obvious is not always obvious. And you're smart designer, your smart developer, your smart anything, will need to build interfaces or products for people that most of the time are very smart, but they are not smart all the time. So think about what kind of decision making Superman has, and what kind of decision making and limits Clark Kent has. And you can say he's the same person, yes, but it's different time of the day, right? So if, for example, we have oil and gas operator, and that person has been on a shift for, let's say, 12 hours, and then there is something that happened, I would not assume that that very smart person will be 100% at that moment, right? But still, they need to operate in a matter of minutes, right? So if there's a leak, 10 minutes, if not, everything shuts down and everybody loses money, right? So the situation is that whenever we're designing interfaces, whenever we're assuming that the system needs to work, we need to not only think about, let's say, the smart people, but we need to figure out to allow the user to abstract the intellect out of the decision making. So there is just a very straightforward green sign that you can find here, you can find there, you can see it in case that there is fire, and there's most likely a lot of adrenaline going on. Well, that smart person is not thinking at this moment, and that's exactly what we want. Okay, so far we have 5 tactics. As I said, they are not the only ones. And how does it look like in real life? Most of the time, those tactics are going to look like questions. And whenever we have, let's say, a question that is related to innovation, work, funding, freedom, communication, and context, are going to look like how. Yeah, and I put it like, how are we replicating the same mistakes? How the user will get lost, and so on, right? The whole idea is to allow the team and the group to ideate and find ways in their own terms, right?
So whenever there's been my involvement in user interface design, there are always very strong emotional opinions that contradict each other. And people get a lot of religious fervor behind ideas that sometimes I think are ridiculous and crazy and frankly violate the principles you've described to us. How do you deal with that?
Well, that's human experience right there, right? So many of the things that we build are pretty much essential for quite a lot of people, right? So in many ways, that's why we need to implement processes for validation. So certainly, if we have time for user testing and being able to really apply the methodology that will give us a concrete answer for what we're looking for, I think that most likely is going to resolve some of that. At the same time, there is a possibility that either there is no budget for that, or there is no time. So in that sense, certainly we have a very well-established set of criteria that we can use in order to reduce some of the uncertainty. Most of the time, you cannot avoid that 99% of the time, right? But still, you have to trust the people that you work with and the process. And even if that is not 100% bulletproof, that's why we have all these cycles of iteration. So even if there is a problem, and that was most likely brought up, I will never raise my hand and say, I told you so, right? So we need to have these long-lasting relationships to make it work. But yeah, sometimes don't, right? But I don't know if that helped you. That's it.
Great. So you're in a room here full of data people, and the biggest application I can see for UX is in data visualization. What is the biggest mistake you see in data visualization from a UX perspective?
Okay. Well, there are a bunch of them. And then the first one, okay, let's say the first thing that we need to understand is that data is a correlation of how we perceive reality. So, for example, most of the time when we have classification that doesn't really understand the user, let's say there are some forms that only has 2 genders, right? And we have people that either have to choose or not, right? And when we assume that the data is really 100% the reality, that's when we are going to run into issues. So certainly we can visualize something that is not matching the real world, and if we make decisions based on that, that's going to be a problem. Another part is when we are presenting two pieces of information that could be misleading, and sometimes, let's put it this way, So, for example, you can always build a narrative about the data. Let's say I've been in a situation where a company says, "Hey, we have an average, the cost of our users is $50, right? Like they spend $50 all the time, and that's fantastic, and maybe they spend maybe $1 or $2 on onboarding that user, and that somehow makes sense, right? But if you present it in one way where the visualization doesn't really tell the whole story, most likely you're going to have an issue, because you're going to have users that maybe spend 25 cents, and you're going to have users that spend $2 million, right? And the thing is that they made that call, they made the decision, and they didn't acknowledge that those VIP users were driving the average way too high. And whenever they made a decision about customer support, they didn't account for a Korean user that didn't have customer support in Korean. So that user left, and he took all his meetings. So let's say data sometimes can tell a story, but we need to kind of think on how that decision-making process happened, and also the kind of categorization that is driving some of the questions that show up there. Right? I hope that makes sense to you.